The mop stopped halfway across the marble floor. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither one said a word for 5 full seconds. He owned the mansion, the company, practically everything this young woman saw every day, cleaning room after room, never imagining what she was about to discover. She had no idea who he really was, but he knew something she didn't know about herself. He'd spent 17 years searching for a face like hers, and now that face was standing in front of him, wearing a cleaning uniform and a name tag that wasn't the name he remembered. Something in her eyes stopped him cold. Those eyes, that look, that exact gesture his wife used to make before everything fell apart. Here's what nobody in that house expected. The richest man in the city was about to ask a question that would change 2 lives forever, and he still didn't know if he had the courage to ask it. Stay with this one, because what happens in the next few minutes isn't just a coincidence. It's a 17-year-old wound, finally opening. Richard Halden was 58 years old, and according to every business magazine, he was a man who had everything. A 14-bedroom mansion, a company worth billions, a name that opened doors in any city in the world, employees who treated him with a mix of respect and fear, partners who flew hours just to spend 15 minutes in a room with him. But in his personal life, the rooms of that enormous house mostly felt empty and silent. But behind that fortune was an emptiness no contract, no acquisition, no headline could ever fill. 17 years earlier, his wife Elena had disappeared with their 6-year-old daughter, Sophia, in the middle of a brutal divorce, full of lawyers, accusations, and silences that stretched on for decades. Richard never knew, with any certainty, what happened next. There were rumors. There was a car accident reported in another state, months after they left. There were legal papers that never fully resolved, files that piled up in drawers nobody ever opened again. Some acquaintances told him Elena had moved overseas. Others said she'd simply vanished without a trace, determined to start over far from him and everything he represented. Richard hired investigators. He spent a small fortune trying to find his daughter, but the trail went cold, year after year, until even the best private detectives told him, carefully, that maybe it was time to accept the most painful possibility of all. Each new investigator arrived with the same optimistic promise, and left months later with the same tired apology. "There's nothing more we can do, Mr. Halden." Some suggested grief counselors, convinced there was nothing left to investigate. He never accepted that possibility. Not completely. He kept a box of photographs, locked in a drawer in his office. Photographs he couldn't look at too often, because every time he did, he lost the rest of the day. His colleagues knew not to mention his daughter in business meetings. His personal assistant had learned, over the years, to quietly clear his schedule on the exact date Elena and Sophia had left, knowing he wouldn't be able to focus on anything else that day. Inside that box were children's crayon drawings, a letter Elena never managed to send, tiny shoes that once fit a 6-year-old's feet. What he didn't know was that, 10 miles from his mansion, a 23-year-old woman named Mia, that was the name on her ID, the name she'd believed was hers for as long as she could remember, cleaned houses for a living, after growing up in a string of foster homes, knowing almost nothing about her life before the age of 6. Mia was smart, observant, and quietly exhausted by a world that had never explained why her childhood seemed to start from nothing. No roots, no photographs, nobody who remembered her first day of school. She'd learned, over the years, to stop asking questions nobody could answer. It was easier to accept the emptiness than to keep knocking on closed doors. Every new foster home brought the same uncomfortable conversation, the same thin file, the same pitying looks from adults who didn't know what to say to a girl with no past. When the cleaning agency assigned her the Halden mansion that morning, she felt nothing special about it. It was just another big house, another workday, another marble floor that needed shining before noon. She wore her worn uniform, her rubber gloves, and followed the same quiet routine she repeated in dozens of similar houses every month, moving from room to room, without anyone really noticing her presence. What she didn't know was that somewhere in that very house, Old photographs sat in boxes nobody had opened in years. Photographs of a little girl with her exact same eyes. And then, everything changed. Richard came down the stairs that afternoon, distracted, checking his phone, when he stopped dead in front of the main living room. A young woman knelt on the floor, scrubbing at a stain, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, completely unaware that anyone was watching her. Richard felt the air leave his chest. It wasn't just her face. It was the way she tilted her head to the left when she concentrated. It was a gesture Elena used to make exactly the same way, almost 2 decades ago, before everything fell apart. It was the kind of tiny detail no private investigator could ever put in a report, because no report captures the exact way someone tilts their head, or the slight furrow of a brow while focusing on something small. "Sorry," Mia said, finally noticing him, standing up quickly. "I didn't mean to startle you, Mr. Halden. I'm almost finished here." She brushed the dust off her knees, ready to move on to whatever other room he might need. Richard couldn't answer right away. His voice had gotten stuck somewhere between shock and a fear he hadn't felt in 17 years. His hands tightened around the phone in his pocket, an old habit from years of bracing for disappointing news. What's your name?" he finally asked, his voice breaking. "Mia," she answered, confused by the intensity of the question. "Mia Torres." "Is something wrong, sir?" Her tone stayed professional, but her eyes already searched for signs of what was actually happening. Richard shook his head, trying to compose himself, but his hands trembled slightly. "No, nothing's wrong," he said, though clearly something was. Can I ask you something personal?" His usually firm, confident businessman's voice sounded fragile now, almost childlike. Mia tensed slightly. Personal questions from wealthy men rarely ended well for women in her position. She'd learned, in this line of work, to read quickly when a conversation veered into uncomfortable territory. "Do you remember anything from your childhood before you turned 6? The question stopped her cold. "No," she said slowly, lowering her eyes to the mop she still held. "Nothing. I grew up in foster care. They told me there was an accident, that my mother died, that there was no family they could locate." Her voice grew quieter with every word, as if reciting a story she'd repeated so many times she barely felt anything saying it anymore. Each new home had brought the same thin paperwork, the same careful explanations from strangers who barely knew her. Richard felt the floor shift beneath him. "Do you have this?" he asked, pulling out his phone, showing an old, worn photograph of a smiling little girl in a yellow dress, the image slightly blurred by the years, but unmistakable to him. Mia stared at the photograph for several long seconds. Her hand slowly rose to her own neck, where a small butterfly pendant hung from a thin chain, the exact same pendant the girl in the photo was wearing. "This," her voice broke. "I've always had this, for as long as I can remember. Nobody ever knew where it came from. One of my social workers told me it was probably a gift from my mother, but they never found any record of who she actually was. I spent years wondering if someone would eventually show up with an answer, and after a while, I just stopped expecting it." She paused, her thumb tracing the small wings of the pendant out of habit. Richard nearly fell to his knees in front of her, his legs no longer able to hold him the way they had a moment ago. The phone in his hand felt heavier than it had ever felt before, as if it carried the full weight of 17 years. "That photograph," he said, his voice completely shattered, "is of my daughter, Sophia. She disappeared 17 years ago, with her mother, in the middle of a divorce that never should have been as cruel as it was. I searched for her for years. I never stopped looking, not even when everyone told me it was time to stop. I hired every investigator I could find. I offered rewards. Nothing worked." His voice cracked completely on the last sentence, the words barely making it out above a whisper. Mia stepped back, her mind trying to process 17 years of unanswered questions, collapsing into one impossible instant. A lifetime of wondering why no one had ever claimed her, why there was no one in her family tree, crumbling in front of a man who looked at her like she was the answer to a prayer he'd repeated for almost 2 decades. She felt the marble floor beneath her feet, the same floor she'd scrubbed that morning without a second thought, suddenly become the strangest and most important place in the world. That can't be, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm just the cleaning lady. She glanced down at her own hands, work-worn and chapped, as if trying to find proof that this version of her story made more sense than the one he was offering. No, Richard said, the tears finally falling without restraint. I think you're my daughter. You could feel, in that room, 17 years of silent searching, colliding, all at once, with an answer no amount of money could ever buy. But that fate decided to hand him anyway, in the most unexpected way possible. Not in a boardroom, not in an expensive detective's report. On his knees, in front of a mop, in his own living room. The DNA test results came back 11 days later. 11 days of Richard barely sleeping, going through old boxes, finding birth certificates, photographs, a hospital bracelet sealed in an envelope he'd never had the courage to open before. Every box he opened brought back a memory he'd mirrored, kept locked away for 17 years. Small pieces of a life he thought he'd lost forever. 11 days of Mia questioning everything she thought she knew about her own life, staring into the mirror, searching for features that suddenly seemed obvious. She called her best friend 3 times that week, repeating the same impossible question. What if it's actually true? What if, after 23 years, she'd finally found out where she came from? When the call from the lab finally came, Richard was sitting in his office, the phone trembling in his hand. Mr. Halden, the voice on the other end said, the genetic match is 97%. She's your daughter. Richard couldn't hold back the tears. Not the controlled tears of a businessman, the raw, uncontrolled tears of a father who could finally, after almost 2 decades, stop searching. He called Mia immediately. She arrived at the mansion 30 minutes later, still in her cleaning uniform, her hands shaking, as she opened the front door, the same door she'd cleaned hundreds of times, without knowing she did one day walk through it, as the daughter of the house. It's true, Richard said, barely able to get the words out. It's you. You're Sophia. His voice cracked on her name, a name he hadn't said out loud in years without it catching in his throat. Mia stood frozen for several seconds, her mind still resisting something so enormous. Something nothing in her life had ever prepared her to hear. She looked around the room, the same marble entryway she'd cleaned so many times, now seeing it through completely different eyes. And then, she simply cried. Not out of sadness, out of something more complicated. The strange relief of finally having an answer after a lifetime of unnamed questions, after years of birthdays with nobody who remembered her first steps, her first word, the exact sound of her laugh as a little girl, after years of filling out medical forms with the word unknown in the space reserved for family history. Here's the meaning moment, the part that turns this from a surprising coincidence into something deeper. Richard didn't get his daughter back because of his money, his investigators, or any resource the world associated with his fortune. He got her back because of a small gesture, a tilt of the head, a pendant a frightened little girl never took off. This time, fate didn't need anything money could buy. All those years, all those expensive investigators, and in the end, all that mattered was an ordinary workday and a marble floor that needed cleaning. That image, a father and daughter, finally reunited, in the exact place fate chose to cross their paths, is the freeze frame the whole story builds toward. Not wealth, not inheritance. Just 2 people who, without knowing it, had been searching for each other through 17 silent years. She never needed to know who he was to feel, from the very first day, that this house felt different. Now, finally, she understood why. After everything Richard and Mia went through that day, 17 years of silent searching, a butterfly pendant, an answer no private investigator could ever find, a chance encounter, in a room that changed the course of 2 lives forever. There's something that stays with you long after the video ends. Sometimes, the answers we search for hardest aren't where we expect to find them. They're closer than we think. So tell me, have you ever felt an unexplainable connection to someone before you knew why? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and these stories matter more than you'd think. Because every real story you share reminds me why I keep telling these stories. If this story touched you even a little, hit subscribe. Not for us, but for everyone out there still searching for an answer they don't even know exists yet. And if this one moved you, wait until you see what happens when a teacher secretly pays for a student's lunch for 4 years straight, and finally finds out why. Until then, take care of each other.